Hello, everyone. If you feel like you're stressed or anxious or have a lot of negative thoughts, this episode is for you. I am interviewing Nicole Vignola. She is a neuroscientist. She's the author of Rewire. And in this episode, we're talking about the difference between stress and anxiety and how to manage anxiety if you have anxiety. We talk about the brain's propensity for prioritizing negative thoughts. It's called the negativity bias. And she talks through step by step how to overcome your negative default thinking. I want to give a big thank you to Nicole, who showed up for this interview, even though she had a double root canal and was in a lot of pain. So, although the episode is on the shorter side, it is packed with really applicable tools. You want to make sure that you go get her book. It's called Rewire. I'm currently reading it and I cannot recommend it enough. I'm talking about it with my friends all the time. And the things that we talk about are just like the tip of the iceberg. There's so much good stuff in her book. So make sure you go order it wherever you find your books. Without further ado, here is Nicole. Nicole, tell us what neuroplasticity is.
So sorry, hang on. Let's do my hair.
You're good.
Sorry. All right, let's crack on.
Let's do it. Crack on. I love it.
So yeah, firstly, thanks so much for having me. So neuroplasticity is the ability to change the pathways in your brain. So when we are born with a set of neurons and a number, which we have the same amount of number when we are around age 25. But what's interesting is that the density changes over time. And what happens is that these neurons will communicate and connect to other parts of the brain and form based on the input that it is being received. So we learn from our environment, from our culture, maybe religion if you're religious, your parents, peers, and those around you, and you learn a set of rules of how the world how the world is, a set of rules of how to behave in the world. And that's generally speaking programmed by your peers. The great thing about neuroplasticity is that we can change that in our adult years. So any habits, behaviors, or thought processes that you may have that are holding you back, we can absolutely change.
Which is just the best news, because if somebody's feeling or behaving in a certain way, there's always hope that you can change it and shift it.
Absolutely. And I always pose the question, is the programming you have really yours, or is it some programming that was given to you by the people before you, and are you on the trajectory that you want for yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Which I think, you get into adulthood and you're like, okay, all of these things that I'm currently thinking, the way I'm behaving is passed down to me. And how do I want to shift my life going forward?
Sure.
So you talk in your book about stress versus anxiety.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us the difference between stress and anxiety and how to kind of approach these two things?
Yeah, so the way that I've described it in the book, the biggest difference is that if you feel a particular way, there's a big overlap in stress and anxiety. And anxiety can trigger stress and stress can trigger anxiety. But generally speaking, if you were to remove the external stimulus, maybe the deadline or whatever it is that's making you anxious, is that feeling still there? If it is, then that is generally speaking anxiety. If it's not, then it's more related to stress. And of course, there's an overlap because the worry can be exacerbated by one or the other. And I think that understanding the difference between the two is really important, because when we gain that emotional awareness and we can say what we're actually feeling, we can gain control of the situation. Because a lot of the times, anxiety is a lack of control in your environment or with what's potentially happening, or worry about the future. And by gaining control and saying, well, actually, I feel stressed because X, Y, Z, or maybe it is anxiety because you do have a deadline, it puts you back in a state of power and control where you can rationalize and re-engage parts of the brain, the frontal cortex, that are responsible for more logic, more cognitively demanding tasks, and alleviates your thought processes from that limbic emotional brain that worries.
Yeah. How do you start to address anxiety? Is this something that you said, getting aware of your thoughts? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah. So sorry, could you repeat the question?
So how do you how do you start to address anxiety if you're like, okay, the stressor is removed, so I know, and I still feel this way, and I know I'm not stressed.
Yeah.
What are your tools to start to address anxiety to make somebody feel better?
Absolutely. So, one of the things to understand is that anxiety could potentially be part of a habit loop. So, we feel a particular way because we were anxious about something, and then we gain relief from the anxiety and the worry. And that can form a loop in itself where you become habituated to feeling this particular way and triggering these thought processes and pathways that lead you down a state of worrying and rumination, etc. So one of the best tools for anxiety that I think everyone can do is to step outside and go for a walk. When we walk, our eyes are moving laterally side to side. You're not actually thinking about doing that. It is what happens. And what that does is it activates a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which resides in the front part of your brain. And that activation competes for resources with the amygdala, which is your fear processing center. And so they work in tandem. When one is on, the other one is off. And so what happens is you can think about your problems and about the worries in your life without the fear processing involved. And that helps you to rationalize them and essentially compartmentalize them into something that is more tangible and less emotionally loaded, if you will. So going for a walk is one of the best tools to help alleviate yourself of these thoughts and feelings.
Oh, that is such a good, like, applicable tool. When you're walking, are you thinking you said you're going through the problem in your brain and you're kind of trying to like problem solve as you're walking, or should this be like more of a meditative walk where you're not thinking about it at all and you're listening to a meditation or something like that?
I think either or works. And I think what's probably better is to actually walk with a friend maybe and talk it out loud. When we talk about our problems, especially with our fear processing area that's been diminished in activity, we put a narrative to the story. So a lot of the times in our mind, thoughts reside within an area called the default mode network, which is quite a big brain area. And I don't know if you can resonate with this, but a lot of our thoughts are seemingly incoherent, especially ruminative thoughts. They don't really have a beginning and an end. They don't have a storyline. So when we have to generate words, we actually recruit smaller parts of the brain that again reside within our temporal lobes, a little bit closer to the frontal cortex. And what that does is it forces you to put your thoughts into a streamlined sort of narrative, for lack of a better term. And what that does is it forces you to really think about it, and it kind of bookmarks how you're feeling from beginning to end so that you can rationalize it. Have you ever had it when you feel a particular way and then you either talk it out loud or you try to write it down or you think about it and then you either think, oh, okay, well, actually it wasn't that bad, or you don't know how to explain yourself because the thoughts in your mind are different to what's actually coming out. And sometimes it's hard. That requires a lot of frontal cortex activity to be able to really think about how we're feeling. And that alleviates us from the pressures of those thoughts.
That is okay. I thought I was maybe the only person that felt like that. That like I have this. Yeah, no, that is so validating.
Yeah.
Well, and it's almost like your primitive brain is like telling you these thoughts to try to like keep you safe. I mean, I'm sure you can explain it more eloquently. And bringing it forward to your problem solving brain might help you be like, oh, because sometimes I'll do this process where I'll like write down every thought that I have, like on a blank document. I'll just like as quick as I can and get it all out. And a lot of times I'll read it back and I'll be like, oh, that when I read that out loud, like that's ridiculous. That's not the truth. Or that's like why am I thinking that? Like that's not logical at all.
Yeah.
But it's because maybe it hasn't gone into my like the prefrontal cortex yet for my prefrontal cortex to decide like, oh, this isn't something that we want to continue thinking.
Yeah. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for determining whether there's whether what you're saying or thinking is right or wrong. So we have this kind of conflict monitoring within the frontal cortex that kind of assesses your thought processes more logically and says, no, this one we're going to park. This one, let's pay attention to. Maybe we're feeling like that because X, Y, Z. And it kind of helps us. It's like a CEO. It helps you just kind of understand what is going on. But when we don't engage it, and of course, that's that's a bit futile to say that in such loose terms. Of course, it's engaged to some degree. But if we can learn to reinstate this level of logic in our life when we're feeling a particular way, what happens over time is that we actually strengthen the functional connectivity between that part of the brain and the limbic system, which is your emotional brain. So over time, you're still going to feel the emotions, and you absolutely should. But what happens is you become better at being able to regulate and rationalize over time.
Oh, that is so, so good. I've definitely felt like my emotional maturity has improved by doing a similar process to what you talk about in your books, like just getting more aware of your thoughts and trying to, and using some of these tools. So I think that's awesome.
And that's neuroplasticity.
One thing,
sorry to interrupt.
Right. That's neuroplasticity at work. But as you say, it takes reps and it takes time. Like it's not something that's going to you're going to see an immediate difference in one day. Like I feel like it's been taking me like years in the reps. Yeah. Well, something you talk about, so many fascinating things in your book. One of the things that I think is really interesting is cognitive overload and how we only have a limited amount of energy, and we want to be conscious of where we're putting that energy. And one thing that you talked about in your book a lot that I want you to speak to more is a lot of people use social media as like a brain break, but it's not actually giving your brain a break. Can you speak to that, this cognitive overload thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the basis of my research, is that people will go on their phones thinking that because they're task switching from whatever they're doing on their computer to the phone, that's a mental break. And it will give you a sense of relief. But cognitively speaking, from an energetic point of view, actually using up, the energy in your brain, you are still spending energy somewhere, and that is now on social media. So what I saw in my research and other bodies of research around it is that when we then divert our focus back to the task at hand, our ability to make decisions has been diminished, and our ability to sustain focus has been diminished as well. And that is because social media pulls on more of these energy resources. And so I called it mental currency in layman's terms. And I love that term because you're essentially, it's not social media is not a bad thing. It's just how conscious you are where you're spending your money. And if you're spending all of your money on social media, then what happens is you come home after a long day. Now you've spent a lot of your currency at work, making decisions there, then driving home. Maybe that was stressful, and then social media as well. And then you get home and your ability to make decisions has now been impacted because you don't have enough currency left for making dinner, going to the gym when you said you were going to, and you end up ordering in and lying on the sofa, which again is fine in moderation. But if you're doing that every single day, then I really call for people to take a look at how they're spending the mental currency, because there's a lot of this kind of hidden costs, if you will, that we don't realize we're spending our money on.
Right. So instead of if someone's going to reach for their phone, they're like, okay, I'm going to take a little break from the task I'm doing. They reach for their phone. What would maybe be a better thing? What would be a more effective break?
Yeah. So with my research, we did mindfulness meditation, but anything that is essentially helping you disconnect from the external world. So anything that has an external stimulus is going to have an impact on this currency. So think about it in an energy preservation way. If you do anything that's going to shut off from the world, it means you can really save energy and replenish some of it as well. So things like just closing your eyes for 10 to 20 minutes. Some people will meditate. Some people will call it a non-sleep deep rest. Some people can nap as well. My partner's a prolific napper. He can do that 10-minute thing where he's just like, he doesn't even fall asleep and he just feels amazing afterwards. Maybe it's a walk.
It's a skill.
Yeah, it really is. Maybe it's a stretch or anything that can just help you decompress and kind of go into yourself and just maybe even ask the question, how are you doing? How often do you ask yourself that?
Right. What about exercise? Does exercise deplete your mental energy, or does that re-energize?
It depends.
From a mental standpoint.
It depends. I mean, if you're putting in the reps every single day and you're following a program that's pretty similar, I mean, this is me just speculating. I haven't actually looked at the data on this, and I'd love to subsequently do more research on this myself. I would imagine that's something that takes low effort in the sense that you do the same thing every time and it doesn't cost you much. It could probably be quite meditative for you. Whereas for somebody who maybe doesn't exercise often and finds it a bit of a chore, quote unquote, that may then pull on more of your energy resources. Whereas someone who maybe is a runner, a 5K run will be something that helps them decompress. Hard to really know. I would say assess it and see whether that helps.
Right. I always feel energized mentally, and I feel like my mental clarity after exercising is always way better. But I've been lifting weights for years now, and my body has patterns that it knows.
Exactly.
So I feel like maybe if you were newer to lifting weights or you were newer to some form of exercise and you have to focus a lot more, it would probably be more exhausting to you.
Yeah.
So if you're newer to lifting then, or if you're newer to any form of exercise, would that be something that maybe you would want to do at the end of the day so that you don't deplete yourself more, or in the beginning of the day, or does it really matter?
So we tend to have high levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in the first 8 hours upon waking. So ideally, if you're trying to take on, and this works really well in the form of adopting a new habit. So if you're trying to adopt a new habit and it requires a lot of effort, it is probably in your best interest to put it within the first 8 hours. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not going to work in the evening. It just means that maybe there's a little bit more that kind of resistance, which you need to override, those thoughts and feelings that say, hey, we don't have to do this, because these pathways that have been ingrained, like yours and mine, I lift, you're probably more than me, but these pathways are automatic, right? You don't even think about whether you're going to or not. You just are, because that's what you practiced for a long time, right? And for someone who hasn't, those pathways won't be there. So what will happen is you have to essentially carve them out. So every time you hit with that wall of should I, shouldn't I, it's going to feel like a little bit of a struggle, for lack of a better term. But the more you do it, the more reps you put in, the more you're going to carve out this path. And then eventually it becomes something that you just do without thought, right? It's an non-negotiable.
The beginning is probably the hardest part. When it comes to forming a new habit, any new habit, you said the resistance in the beginning is hard. When does it start to get easier? Like, how many reps does it take to where it starts to become easier? And then how many reps does it take to where it starts to become automatic?
It's hard to say. I mean, the data around habits is all quite messy. How do you even begin to really study that in a controlled environment? People have different lives, different, facets of life all the time, different repetitions. But so the data says anywhere between 18 to 254 days. But what that means is that
that's a lot.
But it could be 18, it could be 254.
Yeah.
It depends on what we're trying to incorporate. If you're maybe trying to become an Ironman and you smoke 30 cigarettes a day, this is probably going to take you a little bit longer than if you already have a base level of fitness and now you want to become an Ironman, So what that really shows us, though, is that it's down to the reps, the consistency, the intensity as well, but the consistency. And that's a really pertinent point, because a lot of people will say, oh, I haven't got an hour to go to the gym, so I just won't do it. But you could do 10 minutes. And 10 minutes almost seems like useless, but it's still 10 minutes that you wouldn't have done if you hadn't done it. That makes sense?
Right. So, my philosophy that we always say is B+ and out the door is better than A+ and never done.
Yeah.
Like, just get something done, even if it's not your A+ work. But those B+s accumulate.
Yeah.
And versus like if you did A+ work that you never did consistently, your results from B+ over and over and over are going to be a lot better than the A+ that was never done.
100%. Love that.
Yeah. Nate, shifting gears.
Yes.
I have so much I want to ask you. I'm like, oh my gosh, your book, Rewire, is so good. It's so good. I've been talking about it with all my friends. I love it.
Where are you based?
Sorry, say that again.
Where are you based?
We are in Austin, Texas.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to
You're in
know.
the UK, right? London?
I'm actually in Portugal, but we're in the same time zone as the UK, and I work with the UK, so I'm flying to the UK next week for work. But I'm just wondering,
Oh,
I've had a lot of podcast requests from Texas, actually. So I'm thinking, because I was in LA and New York earlier this year, I'm thinking South next year. So
oh, you got to come to Austin and you got to come to our space. We try to
yeah,
do in real life interviews. So when you come to Austin, let me
yeah,
know and we'll connect and do another episode because there's
yeah.
so many things I want to talk to you about. Um, but I'll keep it here because I know for the listeners you just had a root canal and so we're trying to respect your cognitive overload and because
Thank
you're in a
you.
lot of pain.
Thank you. I had
Oh,
two actually, but that's a long story.
two?
Two in a row,
Oh,
right after each other. So
oh my gosh.
yeah.
You are such a champ for even being here. Okay, so this will be the last question.
Oh, bless you.
Ne- Negativity bias.
Oh.
Tell us what that is and how we shift from our default thinking of negativity bias.
So we have this, I don't like saying hardwiring because it's not hardwired. We can definitely change it. But we do have a penchant or a penchant, if you're English, for focusing on the negative. And that is because, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. We need to know what, is going to potentially kill us. And, we're wired for survival. And what that also tells us is that we have, so out of the 8 basic emotions, we have 4 that are negative, 2 that are positive, so joy and trust. And then we have 2, anticipation and surprise, which are potentially negative or positive depending on the situation. So the majority are negative, only 2 are positive, and 2 are negative or positive, even though we have a tendency to lean more towards negativity. Because anticipation could be excitement, but it's generally anticipation of a worry of something in the future. And surprise as well, like you get a surprise text bill, like I just did, that you weren't anticipating. Hold on, jazz.
The worst.
Yeah.
The worst.
So we tend to dwell on the negative. Now, not only that, our brain registers negative stimuli more greatly than positive stimuli. And again, it's probably because of survival. So we tend to focus on the negative in our life. So this week has been difficult for me because I've been on antibiotics and steroids and, medication, etc. And I felt my mental health lean more towards comparison. So what I've done is I've actually shut off my social media. So I'm still going on and posting, but I'm just not spending any time on it because every time I see someone post, I'm like, I should be talking about that. Or, and I start going down this rabbit hole that I don't want to go down because once you feed that negativity bias, it's a slippery slope, right? And our negativity bias can lead us to assumptions like I'm not good enough or I could never do X, Y, Z because whatever. And the great thing about the brain, again, is that we can change this negativity bias. And the first step is to firstly acknowledge it. So even understanding that you have this negativity bias alleviates a lot of the pressures. So you can actually see people go, oh, okay. So firstly, there's nothing wrong with me. It's me. It's not me. It's my brain. And secondly, it empowers the person to be able to make a change.
Well, that's what I love about your book is that you break down the neuroanatomy in a really simple, easy to understand way. And just understanding like, oh, my brain is wired to lean negative because of you said 7 emotions.
Yeah.
Most of them are negative. So
Yeah.
no wonder I'm leaning toward. So it's almost like you give yourself a little more grace knowing like, oh, that's just like my neuroanatomy. Like, but
Yeah.
knowing that you have the power to shift things, I think is really important. Because a lot of people are like, this is just how I am. It's my personality. I'm a pessimist, like people labeling themselves like pessimist or optimist.
I hate that.
Yeah. I feel like that can, like you said, lead you down a negative spiral that just continues to feed that loop of I'm a negative person. I'm a pessimist. This is how I'm always going to see the world.
Yeah. And it keeps you stuck in this box of this, with this label on it. And then you go through life thinking that this is how things always are. And it's the reason why, this is, going a little bit on a tangent, but, things like attachment styles and the kind of labels that there are in psychology, I don't have an issue with them if people understand that these are not static. they are dynamic. We can change at any point. You may have an anxious attachment now. I've had anxious attachments in previous relationships. I've also had avoidant attachment, or whatever they are. I don't really know much about attachments, but what the important point to make is that the way you feel with somebody might be different in another relationship. And so we change across life, and I think that's what's so wonderful. Isn't it that saying that like change is the only constant or something? It's great.
Yeah. And not feeling so resistant to something when you're like, well, this is how I've always been, or this is how I've always done things. It's like, well, you're in a new chapter. So things are going to be different. You're going to be different. Yeah. I think that's hard for a lot of us to accept because a lot of us don't like change.
No, we don't. And I think, the brain will always prioritize a familiar hell versus an unfamiliar heaven, right? Because even if it's familiar, the brain doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. Of course, our frontal cortex has a moral and it knows what's incorrect and what isn't, but down to the very neurobiology of our neurons and how they fire and how they communicate, they know what's been repeated. So if a particular pattern has been repeated, even if it doesn't make you feel good, it's still going to want to keep you there regardless. And you see that a classic and very dramatic example, which portrays this concept very well, is people who stay in abusive relationships or have come from an abusive household and then become the abusers themselves, because that is what they know best. Even if they know that it's wrong, the body and the brain will perform the pattern every single time unless you begin to break it.
Right. You said that acknowledging the negativity bias is step one. What would be kind of the next subsequent steps?
Step number 2 is reframing. So oftentimes we will jump to a particular conclusion in our brains because of these things called mental heuristics. And what those are mental shortcuts. So your brain will try and take shortcuts to make decisions based on what it has previously known about a situation. And so if you always jump to, so my partner and I made this pact the other day that we were always going to assume the best in people. And it's been really,
I love that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's been challenging, but it's more natural, I think, to assume the worst. And
absolutely.
I was scammed a couple of weeks ago. Long story short.
Oh gosh.
I know. But even then, so we were like, okay, let's not try and sweep that under the rug, but try and see the reasoning in this, And I know that it's a tough one. It's a really tough one to be able to do that. And also not assume that everyone else is bad just because that happened to us as well, which can also happen,
Yes.
And what was my point? My point is to reframe. So step number 1, acknowledging. Step number 2 is reframing. Now, the reframing may need a step A before it, which is a physiological sigh. So let's say you've been cut off in traffic and now you're upset with this person, you jump to the negative conclusion of being angry and assuming the worst, that they are a terrible driver and they're trying to ruin your day, which is not the case usually. What you do is something like the physiological sigh, which helps to regulate your central nervous system back to a state of calm. So what it looks like is an inhale through the nose and then another little inhale through the nose, pause at the top, and a long exhale through the mouth. So let's do 2 together.
Yeah. You got to do the audible.
Yeah. Well, I'm doing it louder now than usual so people can hear.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels good though. I love it. And that's a Huberman thing too, right? He talks about that.
Yeah. And so have you ever been stressed and you start huffing and puffing? You kind of just sigh. It's a good thing. We've associated with a negative thing, again, probably because of our negativity bias, but it's a positive thing. It's your brain trying to regulate your breathing rate and trying to dump carbon dioxide. And so the physiological sigh is one of the best ways, Huberman talks about it, to bring your central nervous system back to a state of calm. And it's pretty non-invasive. I mean, the way we did it right now was pretty loud, but we were only doing that so that, the listeners can hear. But you can do that subtly under your breath. And it's great because then what that will do is will reinstate kind of logical thinking again in this frontal cortex so that you can then reframe into something more realistic. Maybe that person is in a hurry because their kid is sick, or the nanny's just canceled and they have to rush home or whatever. And it doesn't even
Something that I always use with drivers is I always say slow driving makes me is triggering to me. And so when someone's driving really slow, I'm like, maybe they have a casserole in their car that they're trying not to spill. That's what I tell myself every single time. I'm like, they've got a casserole. They're trying not to spill their casserole.
Yeah, they've got a nice big chocolate brownie that they're taking to their mum's house.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I love it. I'm going to take that one on board.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that acknowledgement, potentially physiological sign, and then reframe.
This is excellent. Your book is chock full of tools and things like what you just talked about on this podcast. And that was just like a little tiny piece of the book. Like there are so many great, excellent tools. So tell us about your book. Tell us where we can find you and follow you.
Thank you. So it's Rewire, Break the Cycle, Alter Your Thoughts to Create Lasting Change. You can find it in any bookstore or online, Barnes & Nobles, McNanny, McPherson. I don't know what the store's called.
Do we have that in the U.S.?
Yeah. That's probably why.
McNanny
something. It's a really big one. I can't remember that.
It's a big one. It's a big one.
That one. The big one.
I get that one. You'll know if you know.
Amazon, and then I'm on Instagram as Nicole's Neuroscience and on YouTube as Nicole's Neuroscience.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I know you're super busy and in pain, so we really appreciate it. And we'll have to have you come back when you come to Austin.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.